My grandmother Margaret lived in a one-bedroom apartment that smelled like mothballs and instant coffee. She wore the same three faded dresses, clipped coupons religiously, and asked me to drive her to the discount grocery store every Tuesday because she couldn't afford the fancy places. When she died last month, my cousins were already fighting over who'd pay for her funeral. Turns out, they should have been fighting over something else entirely. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I should probably start by explaining how different I was from the rest of my family. While my cousins Derek and Samantha Patterson were busy posting vacation photos from Europe and showing off their designer handbags, I was working double shifts at Miller's Diner just to keep my studio apartment in downtown Phoenix. My mom, Linda Hill, had always been the black sheep of the Patterson family, which automatically made me the forgotten grandchild. The Patterson family dynamics were pretty straightforward. My grandmother Margaret Patterson had 3 children, my mom Linda, who married young and struggled financially her entire life, Uncle Robert, who became a successful real estate broker and never let anyone forget it, and Aunt Catherine, who married into money and spent most of her time at country club events. Robert's kids, Derek and Samantha, had grown up with every advantage money could buy: private schools, European vacations, cars for their 16th birthdays. Catherine's daughter, Jessica, was even worse. She treated family gatherings like networking events for her Instagram influencer career. Meanwhile, there was me, 23 years old, community college graduate, working at a diner, and driving a 15-year-old Honda Civic that made concerning noises every time I turned left. The contrast couldn't have been more obvious at family gatherings, which is probably why I stopped going to most of them. But Grandma Margaret never treated me differently. Every Tuesday, like clockwork, I'd pick her up from her little apartment on Maple Street for our grocery trips. She'd shuffle out in one of those faded house dresses, carrying a handful of carefully clipped coupons and a calculator that was probably older than me. We'd drive to Save Mart, where she'd spend 45 minutes comparing unit prices on generic breakfast cereals. Her apartment was exactly what you'd expect from someone living on a fixed income. Furniture from the 70s, a tiny television with rabbit ears, walls that had been painted the same beige color for decades. The kitchen was barely big enough for one person, with a refrigerator that hummed loudly and occasionally made ice cubes that tasted like freezer burn. She kept her tea bags in an old mason jar and reused aluminum foil until it had more holes than metal. During our grocery runs, she'd often comment on prices. $3 for a loaf of bread, highway robbery, she'd mutter, reaching for the store brand that was 70 cents cheaper. She'd calculate the per-ounce cost of everything, sometimes pulling out that ancient calculator right there in the aisle. Other shoppers would give her impatient looks, but I never minded waiting. These trips were about more than groceries. What made these outings special was our conversations. While we walked through the aisles, Grandma Margaret would tell me stories about her childhood during the Great Depression, about learning to make meals out of practically nothing, about the importance of saving every penny. She'd talk about her late husband, my grandfather William, who had worked at the Ford plant for 30 years. She painted pictures of a simple life built on hard work and careful spending. My cousins, meanwhile, rarely visited her. Derek was always too busy with his job at his father's real estate firm, driving around in his BMW and closing deals on expensive properties. Samantha was finishing her master's degree in business, funded entirely by Uncle Robert, and spent most of her free time at trendy restaurants, posting food photos online. Jessica lived in California, pursuing her influencer career, which mainly seemed to involve taking selfies at expensive locations. When they did show up for holidays, the contrast was painful to watch. They'd arrive in their designer clothes, stay just long enough to be polite, and leave as quickly as possible. I remember one Thanksgiving when Derek actually took a phone call about a $1 million listing right in the middle of dinner. Grandma Margaret just smiled and served him another helping of store-brand stuffing. Uncle Robert and Aunt Catherine weren't much better. They'd make these performative gestures, bringing expensive wine that Grandma Margaret never drank or fancy chocolates that would sit unopened for months. But they never offered to help with anything practical. When her kitchen faucet broke last year, it was me who spent my day off fixing it with parts from the hardware store. When she needed a ride to her doctor's appointments, I was the one rearranging my work schedule. I didn't mind, honestly. Those Tuesday grocery trips and occasional repair visits were the highlight of my week. Grandma Margaret had this way of making you feel heard, even when you were just complaining about difficult customers at the diner. She'd pour us each a cup of generic brand coffee, sit in her warm armchair, and listen like whatever I was saying was the most important thing in the world. She had this theory that you could tell a lot about people by how they treated those who couldn't do anything for them. "Watch how someone behaves when there's nothing to be gained," she'd say, stirring her coffee slowly. "That tells you who they really are." I thought she was just being philosophical, but looking back, I wonder if she was testing all of us. The health scare came in March. Grandma Margaret had been feeling dizzy and called me instead of Uncle Robert, even though he lived closer. I found her sitting on her kitchen floor, too weak to stand up, insisting she was just tired. I drove her to the emergency room in my noisy Honda, holding her hand while we waited 3 hours to see a doctor. The diagnosis was serious but treatable, a combination of low blood pressure and medication interactions. She'd need monitoring, regular checkups, and someone to help manage her various prescriptions. I immediately offered to move in with her, but she refused. "You've got your own life to live, sweetheart," she said, patting my hand with fingers that felt like paper. That's when the family dynamics really became clear. Uncle Robert and Aunt Catherine had a family meeting without inviting me or my mom. They decided that Grandma Margaret needed to move to an assisted living facility, specifically the cheapest one they could find that would accept her insurance. When I protested that she wanted to stay in her own home, Derek actually laughed. "Hazel, be realistic," he said, using that condescending tone he'd perfected. "She can't afford in-home care, and none of us have time to babysit an old woman. This is the practical solution." The assisted living facility they chose was depressing. Institutional beige walls, the smell of disinfectant mixed with overcooked vegetables, and a staff that seemed perpetually overwhelmed. Grandma Margaret took one look around and her shoulders sagged in a way I'd never seen before. But she didn't complain. She just nodded and said, "If this is what's best." I visited her every day after work. The facility was 40 minutes from the diner, which meant I was usually getting there around 9 p.m., exhausted and still smelling like French fry oil. But seeing her face light up when I walked into her tiny room made every minute of that drive worthwhile. She'd adapted to institutional life the way she'd adapted to everything else, quietly and without complaint. Her few personal belongings looked lost in the sterile space, but she'd arranged them carefully. The same old photographs, her mason jar of tea bags, and that ancient calculator, now sitting on a nightstand next to a bed that wasn't her own. During those visits, I started noticing changes. Nothing dramatic, just small things. She seemed more tired, more fragile somehow. But she also started asking me strange questions. Questions about my plans for the future, about what I wanted to do with my life, about whether I thought family loyalty was a two-way street. "Hazel," she said one evening as I was getting ready to leave, "do you remember what I taught you about watching how people behave when there's nothing to be gained?" I nodded, thinking she was just being nostalgic. "Well," she continued, her eyes sharper than I'd seen them in weeks, "sometimes the most important lessons come from watching how people behave when they think there's nothing to be lost." The call came on a Thursday morning at 5:30 a.m. I was getting ready for the breakfast shift when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was professional but gentle, a nurse from Grandview Banner, telling me that Margaret Patterson had passed peacefully in her sleep. I sat on my unmade bed, still holding my waitress uniform, trying to process what I'd just heard. My first instinct wasn't grief, it was panic about who would handle the arrangements. I knew Uncle Robert and Aunt Catherine would want everything done as cheaply as possible, probably cremation at some discount funeral home with a 15-minute service. But when I called Uncle Robert to break the news, his response surprised me. "Oh, thank God you called first," he said, sounding genuinely relieved. "Catherine and I were just discussing this possibility. We think it's best if you handle all the arrangements. You were closer to her after all, and frankly, we're both swamped with work right now. What he meant, of course, was that dealing with a poor old woman's funeral wasn't worth their time. They assumed it would be a simple, cheap affair, maybe a few $100s for cremation, a brief service at whatever funeral home offered the best deal. Derek even suggested I keep it under 1,000 when he called later that morning. I spent my day off driving around Phoenix, visiting funeral homes and trying to figure out how to give Grandma Margaret a decent farewell on a budget that barely existed. The cheapest option was still $800 for basic cremation with no service. I'd have to use my entire emergency fund, the money I'd been saving to maybe take a community college course in accounting. That's when things got weird. I was sitting in the parking lot of Sunset Memorial Services, trying to decide if I could afford their basic package, when my phone rang again. This time, it was someone named Thomas Mitchell, claiming to be Grandma Margaret's attorney. I almost hung up, thinking it was some kind of scam. My grandmother didn't have an attorney. People who clip coupons for generic cereal don't have attorneys. But Thomas Mitchell was very real, and he was calling from a law firm downtown that occupied 3 floors of a glass high-rise. He asked if I could come in that afternoon to discuss Mrs. Patterson's estate. I explained that there wasn't really an estate to discuss, just some old furniture and maybe a few dollars in a savings account. "Miss Hill," he said carefully, "I think you should come in. There are some things we need to discuss in person." Then came the part that really knocked me off balance. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Grandma Margaret's careful handwriting. Inside was a letter that I'd read a dozen times since, but I'll never forget the first time. "My dearest Hazel, if you're reading this, then Thomas has told you about the money. I imagine you're shocked and probably a little angry that I kept this a secret. I hope you'll understand why I had to. I've spent the last decade watching how my children and grandchildren treated me when they thought I was just a poor old woman living on Social Security. I've seen who visited, who called, who offered help without expecting anything in return. I've seen who truly cared about me as a person, and who was just going through the motions of family obligation. You never asked me for anything, Hazel, not once. When your car broke down last year, you took the bus to visit me rather than asking for money. When I needed help with my groceries, you used your day off. When I was scared in that hospital, you held my hand and told me everything would be okay, even though I could see you were scared too. Your cousins see family as a network for advancement. Your uncles and aunts see relationships as transactions. But you see people as people, regardless of what they can do for you. That's why everything goes to you. Use this money wisely. Help people who need it the way you helped me. And don't let the others make you feel guilty about receiving what they think they deserved. They had the same opportunities you did. They chose differently. All my love, Grandma Margaret. P.S. The real estate portfolio includes your Uncle Robert's office building. His lease is up next month. I trust you'll handle that situation appropriately." Thomas Mitchell was watching my face as I read. When I finished, he handed me another document, the will itself. It was comprehensive and airtight. Everything went to me. The money, the properties, the investments, even her personal belongings. There were specific instructions that nothing was to go to Robert, Catherine, Derek, Samantha, or Jessica Patterson. But there was one exception that made me smile despite everything. She'd left each of my cousins exactly $1, with a note, so they cannot claim they were forgotten. "What about my mother?" I asked. "Your grandmother wanted to discuss that with you personally. There's a separate trust set up for medical expenses and living costs, but she wanted you to decide how to handle that conversation." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The law offices of Mitchell, Stone & Associates were nothing like what I'd expected. Marble floors, mahogany furniture, and lawyers in suits that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Thomas Mitchell himself was a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of calm confidence that comes from handling serious money. He led me into a conference room with windows overlooking downtown Phoenix and offered me coffee from a machine that looked more expensive than my car. Then he opened a thick file folder and changed my entire understanding of reality. "Miss Hill, I've been your grandmother's attorney for the past 37 years, he began. She was a very private woman who preferred to keep her financial affairs confidential, even from family members. He slid a document across the mahogany table. It was a bank statement from Wells Fargo, but the numbers didn't make sense. There were too many digits. I read it 3 times before reality sank in. My coupon clipping, Save Mart shopping grandmother had $14.7 million in various accounts. "This has to be a mistake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Thomas Mitchell smiled kindly. "I assure you it's not. Your grandmother was an extremely shrewd investor. She and your grandfather purchased several properties in Phoenix back in the 1960s and 70s when land was cheap. As the city grew, those properties became extremely valuable. She also invested heavily in technology stocks in the early 1980s, Apple, Microsoft, companies that people thought were risky investments at the time." He opened another folder. "She owned 17 rental properties throughout the Phoenix metro area, a portfolio of blue-chip stocks, several CDs, and had been quietly funding a scholarship program at Arizona State University for the past 15 years. My head was spinning. But she lived in that tiny apartment. She shopped with coupons. She worried about the cost of everything. "Your grandmother believed that wealth was a tool, not a display," Thomas explained. "She lived modestly because she chose to, not because she had to. She wanted to see how her family would treat her when they believed she had nothing to offer them." Then came the part that really knocked me off balance. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Grandma Margaret's careful handwriting. Inside was a letter that I'd read a dozen times since, but I'll never forget the first time. "My dearest Hazel, if you're reading this, then Thomas has told you about the money. I imagine you're shocked and probably a little angry that I kept this a secret. I hope you'll understand why I had to. I've spent the last decade watching how my children and grandchildren treated me when they thought I was just a poor old woman living on Social Security. I've seen who visited, who called, who offered help without expecting anything in return. I've seen who truly cared about me as a person, and who was just going through the motions of family obligation. You never asked me for anything, Hazel, not once. When your car broke down last year, you took the bus to visit me rather than asking for money. When I needed help with my groceries, you used your day off. When I was scared in that hospital, you held my hand and told me everything would be okay, even though I could see you were scared too. Your cousins see family as a network for advancement. Your uncles and aunts see relationships as transactions. But you see people as people, regardless of what they can do for you. That's why everything goes to you. Use this money wisely. Help people who need it the way you helped me. And don't let the others make you feel guilty about receiving what they think they deserved. They had the same opportunities you did. They chose differently. All my love, Grandma Margaret. P.S. The real estate portfolio includes your Uncle Robert's office building. His lease is up next month. I trust you'll handle that situation appropriately." Thomas Mitchell was watching my face as I read. When I finished, he handed me another document, the will itself. It was comprehensive and airtight. Everything went to me. The money, the properties, the investments, even her personal belongings. There were specific instructions that nothing was to go to Robert, Catherine, Derek, Samantha, or Jessica Patterson. But there was one exception that made me smile despite everything. She'd left each of my cousins exactly $1, with a note, so they cannot claim they were forgotten. "What about my mother?" I asked. "Your grandmother wanted to discuss that with you personally. There's a separate trust set up for medical expenses and living costs, but she wanted you to decide how to handle that conversation." The whole meeting felt surreal. 1 hour ago, I'd been worried about affording an $800 funeral. Now I was sitting in a law office, technically worth more than most small businesses, trying to process the fact that my grandmother had been secretly wealthy for decades. "There's one more thing," Thomas said, pulling out a final document. "Your grandmother left specific instructions for her funeral arrangements. She prepaid for everything at Riverside Memorial Chapel, the full service, not the basic package. She wanted a proper send-off, and she wanted you to decide who gets invited." I thought about Derek's suggestion to keep it under 1,000 and almost laughed. Grandma Margaret had already spent more on flowers than my cousins thought the entire funeral should cost. That evening, I drove back to Grandview Manor to collect her personal belongings. The staff was helpful and kind, offering condolences and sharing stories about how much they'd enjoyed her company. She'd apparently been popular with the other residents, often sharing her home-baked cookies and helping others with their crossword puzzles. As I packed her few possessions, the photographs, the mason jar, that ancient calculator, I kept thinking about the letter. She'd been testing us all, watching how we behaved when we thought there was nothing to be gained. And I'd passed a test I didn't even know I was taking. The irony wasn't lost on me. The family members who'd always looked down on me for being poor were about to discover that I was now wealthier than all of them combined. And the grandmother they dismissed as a burden had been quietly more successful than Uncle Robert with all his real estate deals or Aunt Catherine with her country club connections. But first, I had a funeral to plan and some very interesting phone calls to make. I decided to break the news about the inheritance at the funeral. It seemed fitting somehow. Grandma Margaret had always believed in dramatic timing, and this would be her final performance. The service at Riverside Memorial Chapel was beautiful in a way that immediately raised eyebrows. Fresh orchids instead of carnations, a mahogany casket with brass handles, and a reception hall that could seat 200 people. When Uncle Robert arrived with Aunt Catherine, I watched his face change from confusion to concern as he took in the expensive arrangements. "Hazel," he pulled me aside before the service started, "exactly how much did you spend on all this? Because I hope you understand that the family can't reimburse you for going overboard." I just smiled and told him we'd discuss finances after the service. Derek and Samantha arrived 20 minutes late, both checking their phones constantly. Jessica flew in from Los Angeles wearing a black designer dress that probably cost more than I used to make in 2 months. She spent the first 10 minutes taking subtle selfies for her Instagram story. The chapel was filled with people I'd never seen before. Neighbors from Grandma Margaret's old apartment building, fellow residents from Grandview Manor, volunteers from the food bank where she'd apparently been donating anonymously for years. There were also several well-dressed individuals who introduced themselves as business associates and investment advisors. During the eulogy, I shared stories about our Tuesday grocery trips and her philosophy about judging people's character. I talked about her kindness, her wisdom, and her belief that actions mattered more than words. The whole time, I could see my cousins shifting uncomfortably in their seats, probably wondering why this was taking so long when they had other places to be. After the service, I asked the immediate family to stay for a private meeting. Thomas Mitchell had agreed to attend, bringing copies of all the relevant documents. We gathered in a small conference room adjacent to the chapel, me, my mom, Uncle Robert, Aunt Catherine, Derek, Samantha, and Jessica. "I wanted to share some information about Grandma Margaret's final wishes," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mr. Mitchell here was her attorney, and he has some documents to review with everyone." Uncle Robert looked annoyed. "Hazel, I appreciate that you want to handle things properly, but Mom didn't really have anything to leave behind. Maybe a few pieces of furniture we can divide up, but let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be." Thomas Mitchell cleared his throat and opened his briefcase. "Actually, Mr. Patterson, your mother's estate is quite substantial. Perhaps we should begin with the inventory." He started with the real estate portfolio, 17 properties throughout Phoenix, including 2 office buildings, a small shopping center, and multiple rental homes. Current market value? Approximately $4.2 million. The room went completely silent. Then came the investment accounts, stock portfolios, bonds, CDs, and savings accounts, totaling just over $10 million. Derek's mouth actually fell open. Samantha grabbed her father's arm like she was going to faint. "This is impossible," Aunt Catherine whispered. "She lived in that terrible little apartment. She shopped with coupons." "Your mother was a very private person who chose to live modestly," Thomas explained. "She believed in financial discretion." Uncle Robert found his voice first. "Well, obviously, this needs to be divided equally among her children. Robert, Catherine, and Linda each get a third, and then the grandchildren can share portions appropriately." That's when Thomas Mitchell dropped the real bomb. He read the will aloud, word for word. Everything to Hazel Hill. The money, the properties, the investments, everything except for $1 each to Derek, Samantha, and Jessica Patterson, so they cannot claim they were forgotten. The explosion was immediate and spectacular. "This is fraud," Derek shouted, jumping to his feet. "There's no way she left everything to the waitress. We're contesting this immediately." Samantha was crying actual tears. She was clearly mentally incompetent. Someone took advantage of her. Hazel must have manipulated her. Jessica started recording on her phone, apparently thinking this would make good content for her social media. This is literally insane. Like, how is this even legal? Uncle Robert's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Hazel, I don't know what kind of games you played with my mother's emotions, but we will not stand for this. She was obviously not in her right mind." Aunt Catherine was hyperventilating. $14 million? She had $14 million and let us put her in that awful nursing home? My mom, who had been silent through the whole reading, finally spoke up. Maybe she wanted to see who would take care of her regardless of money. "Stay out of this, Linda," Uncle Robert snapped. "Your daughter has obviously been scheming for years." That's when I'd had enough. I stood up and pulled up Grandma Margaret's letter, reading it aloud, word for word. The part about watching how people treated her when they thought she had nothing. The part about seeing who visited, who called, who offered help without expecting anything in return. "She tested all of us," I said when I finished reading. "For 10 years, she watched how we behaved when we thought there was nothing to be gained. And Derek, when was the last time you visited her without being asked? Samantha, how many times did you call her just to talk? Jessica, did you ever once offer to help with anything?" Derek started to protest, but I cut him off. "She had a broken faucet for 2 months before I fixed it. Her medication needed to be organized every week. She needed rides to doctor appointments. Where were all of you?" "We were busy building our careers," Samantha shot back. "We couldn't drop everything every time she needed something minor." "But I could drop everything while working double shifts at a diner?" Uncle Robert tried a different approach. "Hazel, be reasonable. You're 23 years old. You have no experience managing this kind of wealth. Let the adults handle this properly, and of course, you'll be taken care of." Thomas Mitchell intervened smoothly. "Mr. Patterson, I should mention that your mother anticipated these objections. She underwent a complete psychological evaluation 6 months ago, specifically to establish her mental competency. Dr. Sarah Chen at Phoenix General confirmed that Mrs. Patterson was of sound mind and fully understood the implications of her decisions." He handed Uncle Robert a thick folder. "She also documented her reasoning extensively. There are detailed notes about each family member's behavior over the past decade, including dates, times, and specific incidents that influenced her decision." I watched my family flip through page after page of Grandma Margaret's careful observations. The time Derek hung up on her because he was closing a big deal. The Christmas when Samantha spent the entire dinner complaining about the cheap wine and basic food. The birthday when Jessica didn't even call because she was at a music festival. But there were also positive notes about me. Every grocery trip, every repair I'd helped with, every time I'd listened to her stories or brought her soup when she was feeling sick. She'd been keeping track of everything. There's one more thing, Thomas said, pulling out a final document. Mrs. Patterson left specific instructions regarding the property at 124-7 Commerce Street, the building that currently houses Patterson Real Estate. Uncle Robert's face went white. That's my office building. Yes, it was. Your mother owned it through an LLC. Your lease expires next month, and the new owner has the right to set new terms. Thomas looked at me. Miss Hill, would you like to discuss renewal terms now or handle this matter separately? The power dynamic in the room shifted so dramatically I could almost feel it. Uncle Robert, who had spent years looking down on me, was now technically my tenant. His entire business operated out of a building I owned. I think we should handle that separately, I said quietly. Derek tried one last desperate play. Look, Hazel, you know this isn't fair. We're family. Surely we can work out some kind of arrangement where everyone benefits. Like the arrangement where you suggested keeping her funeral under $1,000? The meeting ended with threats of lawsuits and accusations flying in every direction. Uncle Robert and Aunt Catherine stormed out, with Derek and Samantha close behind, all of them calling their own attorneys before they even reached the parking lot. Jessica stayed long enough to ask if I wanted to collaborate on a TikTok about unexpected inheritance drama before realizing I was serious about privacy. My mom and I sat alone in the conference room afterward, both of us still processing what had just happened. I'm proud of you, she said finally. Not because of the money, but because you earned it the right way. You loved her without expecting anything in return. Thomas Mitchell packed up his documents. Miss Hill, I should warn you, they will contest the will. It's inevitable when this much money is involved. But your grandmother prepared for that possibility. The documentation is extensive and ironclad. As I drove home that night, past the Save Mart where Grandma Margaret and I had spent so many Tuesday afternoons, I realized that the real test was just beginning. I'd inherited more than money. I'd inherited a responsibility to prove that she'd made the right choice. The lawsuit started flying within 48 hours of the funeral. Uncle Robert hired a firm that specialized in estate litigation. Aunt Catherine brought in her country club attorney, and Derek somehow convinced his law school roommate to take the case pro bono in exchange for a percentage of any settlement. They filed on 3 different grounds: mental incapacity, undue influence, and fraud. According to their legal papers, Grandma Margaret had been suffering from dementia, I had manipulated her into changing her will, and the whole thing was an elaborate con job. They demanded a complete psychiatric evaluation of her medical records and a forensic accounting of all her financial transactions going back 5 years. Thomas Mitchell called me into his office on Monday morning with a stack of legal documents and a reassuring smile. Miss Hill, I've been through estate battles before, but I've never seen a case where the deceased was better prepared for challenges. Your grandmother anticipated every single argument they're making. He spread out a timeline across his conference table. Starting in 2020, Grandma Margaret had begun documenting everything. Not just the financial records, but detailed personal observations about each family member's behavior. She'd kept a daily journal, noting every phone call, every visit, every interaction. March 15, 2023, Thomas read aloud. Robert called asking for money to help with Derek's graduation party. When I explained I was on a fixed income, he suggested I take out a reverse mortgage on my apartment building. Did not seem to consider that I might want to attend the party, only wanted funding. The entries were devastating. Page after page of documented neglect, selfishness, and casual cruelty. But they also showed a pattern of genuine care for me, helping with groceries, fixing things around her apartment, spending time listening to her stories. Dr. Miles pulled out another folder. She also hired a private investigator, Thomas continued. She wanted to understand exactly how her children and grandchildren were spending their money, particularly whether they were helping other family members in need. The investigator's report was eye-opening. Uncle Robert, despite his successful real estate business, had never once offered financial help to my mom during her various financial crises. Derek and Samantha regularly spent more on weekend trips than I made in a month, but had never offered to help with Grandma Margaret's medical expenses. Jessica's influencer lifestyle was funded by credit cards and sponsorship deals, but she'd never even sent a birthday card. Meanwhile, the report documented my own financial struggles and how I'd still prioritized helping Grandma Margaret. The bus receipts when my car broke down, the grocery receipts showing I'd often paid for her items when she was short on cash, the medical appointment records showing I'd taken unpaid time off work to drive her to doctors. But the real masterpiece, Thomas said with obvious admiration, is this. He handed me a thick legal document dated just 6 months before Grandma Margaret's death. It was a comprehensive psychological evaluation performed by Dr. Sarah Chen, one of Phoenix's most respected geriatric psychiatrists. The evaluation included cognitive tests, memory assessments, and a detailed analysis of her decision-making capacity. The results were unambiguous. Margaret Patterson was of completely sound mind, with above-average cognitive function for her age group. Dr. Chen had specifically noted that Mrs. Patterson demonstrated exceptional clarity regarding family dynamics and showed sophisticated understanding of financial planning and estate management.
Your grandmother paid for this evaluation out of her own pocket, Thomas explained. She told Dr. Chen that she expected her will to be challenged and wanted to establish beyond any doubt that she was making these decisions with full mental capacity. The psychological evaluation included something else that made me smile despite the stress. Grandma Margaret had asked Dr. Chen to document her reasoning for the inheritance decisions. The doctor's notes included detailed explanations of the decade-long assessment period where Mrs. Patterson had observed her family members' behavior while presenting herself as financially limited. Dr. Chen described it as one of the most methodical and well-reasoned approaches to estate planning she had ever encountered, Thomas said. Your grandmother essentially conducted a 10-year character study of her own family. While the legal drama unfolded, I had to figure out what to do with my new reality. Thomas had arranged for a financial advisor named Patricia Gomez to help me understand the scope of what I'd inherited. We met at her office in Scottsdale, where she walked me through every asset. The real estate portfolio was more complex than I'd realized. Beyond the rental properties and office buildings, Grandma Margaret owned a stake in several local businesses: a family restaurant that had been struggling, a small bookstore, and a vintage clothing shop. She'd been quietly investing in local entrepreneurs who reminded her of her younger self. Your grandmother was what we call a stealth philanthropist, Patricia explained. She supported dozens of causes without any public recognition. The scholarship fund at ASU, the food bank donations, emergency assistance for single mothers. She was helping people constantly, but anonymously. The investment portfolio was equally impressive. Grandma Margaret had been buying stocks since the 1970s, focusing on companies she understood and believed in. Her Apple stock alone was worth over $2 million, purchased when the company was nearly bankrupt in the late 1990s. She had better investment instincts than most professional fund managers, Patricia said with genuine respect. She understood that patience and research beat flashy speculation every time. But managing this wealth meant making decisions I'd never imagined facing. The rental properties needed maintenance and tenant management, the business investments required oversight, and then there was the immediate problem of Uncle Robert's office lease. I decided to handle that situation personally. I scheduled a meeting at Patterson Real Estate, walking into the office that I now technically owned. Uncle Robert's secretary, Mrs. Chen, greeted me with obvious confusion. "I'm here to discuss the lease renewal," I told her. Uncle Robert emerged from his office looking like he hadn't slept in days. The legal stress was clearly taking its toll, and having to negotiate with his former waitress niece was adding insult to injury. "Hazel," he said, trying to maintain his professional demeanor, "I'm sure we can work out reasonable terms. I've been a reliable tenant for 15 years." I'd spent the weekend researching commercial real estate rates in downtown Phoenix. Uncle Robert's current lease was significantly below market value, another gift from Grandma Margaret that he'd never recognized or appreciated. "The current lease is $4,800 per month," I said, consulting my notes. "Comparable spaces in this area are renting for $8,500 to $9,200 per month." His face went pale. You can't seriously be considering raising the rent that dramatically. That would destroy my business. Actually, I'm considering not renewing the lease at all, I said quietly. I've had several offers from other businesses interested in this space. The power dynamic was surreal. This man who had spent years dismissing me as a waitress was now pleading for mercy from someone he'd considered beneath his notice. Look, he said, dropping the professional act, I know things got heated at the lawyer's office, family emotions run high during grief, but we can work this out. What do you want? What I wanted was for him to understand what Grandma Margaret had been trying to teach all of us, but I also knew that some lessons can't be forced. I want you to withdraw the lawsuit, I said. All of you. Stop challenging her will, stop claiming she was incompetent, and stop trying to overturn decisions she made with complete mental clarity. Uncle Robert was quiet for a long moment. And if we don't? Then you'll need to find a new office space. And I'll make sure every landlord in Phoenix knows about the lawsuit you filed against your own mother's estate. Meanwhile, the legal battle was intensifying. Derek had started a social media campaign trying to generate public sympathy, painting me as a manipulative gold digger who had taken advantage of a vulnerable elderly woman. Jessica was posting TikToks about family betrayal and stolen inheritance, somehow managing to make herself the victim in a situation where she'd inherited exactly what she'd earned through years of neglect. But their legal strategy was falling apart. Dr. Chen's evaluation was ironclad, the documentation of Grandma Margaret's decision-making process was extensive, and the timeline of family interactions painted a clear picture of who had actually cared for her. Thomas Mitchell called with an update on Friday afternoon. Their attorneys are starting to suggest settlement discussions, he said. I think they're realizing this case isn't winnable. What kind of settlement? They're asking for $1 million each to drop the lawsuits. They're framing it as avoiding costly litigation, but really they're just looking for a payday. I thought about Grandma Margaret's letter, about her belief that people reveal their true character when they think there's nothing to be gained. My family was still trying to profit from a relationship they'd never invested in. No settlement, I said. If they want to fight this, we'll fight it, but I'm not paying them for years of neglect. That weekend, I drove to Grandma Margaret's old apartment building. The new tenant was a young mother with 2 kids who reminded me of myself at that age, struggling but determined. I knocked on the door and introduced myself as the new owner of the building. I just wanted to let you know that your rent won't be increasing, I told her, and if you ever need anything fixed, here's my direct number. As I walked back to my car, I realized that Grandma Margaret had given me more than money. She'd given me the opportunity to be the kind of person she'd always believed I could be. The legal battles would continue, but I already knew who had really won. The legal collapse came faster than anyone expected. Thomas Mitchell called me on a Tuesday morning with news that Uncle Robert's attorney had filed a motion to withdraw from the case, citing irreconcilable differences with the client regarding litigation strategy. In legal terms, that usually meant the lawyer had discovered something that made the case unwinnable and didn't want his reputation attached to it. What they discovered was even more documentation that Grandma Margaret had left behind. Hidden in a safety deposit box that Thomas had only recently accessed, we found video recordings. Apparently, my grandmother had been recording family interactions on her phone for the past 2 years, creating an audio-visual record of exactly how everyone treated her. Derek dismisses her concerns about her health as hypochondria. Samantha rolled her eyes when Grandma Margaret tried to share a story about her childhood. Jessica literally walked away mid-conversation to take a selfie. And Uncle Robert explained to his wife, while Grandma Margaret was in the bathroom, that they should just humor the old bat until she's gone.
But the most devastating recording was from last Christmas. The family had gathered for dinner, and Grandma Margaret had asked if anyone wanted to help her sort through old photo albums. Every single person had declined, too busy with their phones or complaining about the food. The recording captured Derek actually saying, "Can't she just throw that junk away? Nobody cares about ancient history." Thomas played me excerpts over the phone. Your grandmother labeled this file evidence of character, and there are over 40 hours of recordings. Their legal team heard about 30 minutes before they started discussing settlement terms. By Thursday, all 3 lawsuits had been quietly withdrawn. No press releases, no social media announcements, just legal papers filed in court, and a very expensive lesson learned about underestimating a supposedly simple old woman. Uncle Robert was the first to reach out directly, calling me while I was having lunch at Miller's Diner, a place I still visited occasionally, though I no longer worked there. My former boss, Maria Santos, had been treating me like royalty since news of the inheritance had leaked through Phoenix's tight-knit service industry community. Hazel, Uncle Robert's voice was carefully controlled. I think we should talk, family to family, not through lawyers. We met at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory, where neither of us had any advantage. He looked older than he had just weeks earlier, the stress of the failed lawsuit and impending lease renewal clearly taking its toll. I want to apologize, he began, though his tone suggested the words were difficult. I reacted emotionally to the will reading. I was shocked, and I said things I shouldn't have said. I waited for the but that I knew was coming. But you have to understand, from our perspective, this came out of nowhere. Mom never gave any indication that she had money, let alone that she was planning to leave it all to one person. That was the point, I said. She wanted to see how you'd all treat her when you thought she had nothing to offer. Robert shifted uncomfortably. Look, I know I wasn't the most attentive son, business demands, but I never stopped caring about her. When was the last time you called her just to talk, not to ask for something, not because it was a holiday, just to see how she was doing? The question hung in the air between us. We both knew he couldn't answer it. Regarding the lease, he continued, switching to safer ground, I'm hoping we can work out something reasonable. I've been a good tenant, the rent's always been on time, and I've maintained the property well. I'd already made my decision about the office space, but I wanted to hear what he was offering. I can go up to $6,000 a month, he said. That's a 25% increase, which is fair given the current market. The market rate for that space is $8,500, I reminded him. Right, but we're family. Surely that counts for something. The irony was thick enough to cut. Family hadn't counted for anything when he was ignoring Grandma Margaret's needs, but now that he needed something, suddenly it mattered. You're right that family should count for something, I said. That's why I'm not evicting you immediately. You have 60 days to find a new location. His face flushed red. You can't be serious? I've been in that building for 15 years. And you've been getting below-market rent for 15 years, courtesy of the grandmother you just spent 3 weeks trying to prove was mentally incompetent. I left him sitting in the coffee shop, probably calling other attorneys to see if there was any way to fight a lease non-renewal. There wasn't. Meanwhile, I was learning to navigate my new reality with Patricia Gomez's help. We'd restructured the entire portfolio, setting up proper management for the rental properties, and creating a foundation to handle the charitable giving that Grandma Margaret had been doing informally. The Margaret Patterson Foundation launched quietly, focusing on supporting single mothers, funding community college scholarships, and helping local small businesses. I kept my grandmother's approach of staying anonymous, letting the foundation's board handle publicity while I focused on identifying worthy recipients. One of our first major decisions involved the struggling family restaurant that Grandma Margaret had invested in. Casa Rodriguez had been barely surviving since the pandemic, and the owner, Elena Rodriguez, was considering bankruptcy. Instead of writing it off as a loss, I decided to visit in person. Elena was a single mother with 3 kids, working 16-hour days trying to keep her family's restaurant afloat. The place had incredible food, but needed updated equipment and marketing help. Within a month, we'd renovated the kitchen, hired a social media consultant, and turned Casa Rodriguez into one of Phoenix's most popular family dining spots. Your grandmother saved my family, Elena told me during the restaurant's reopening celebration. I never knew who the investor was, but she believed in us when nobody else would. That's what I understood what Grandma Margaret had really left me. Not just money, but the opportunity to see people's potential and help them achieve it. She'd been doing this quietly for decades, and now it was my turn. The family drama wasn't completely over, though. Jessica had pivoted her social media strategy, now posting about forgiveness and family healing while dropping hints about reconciliation. Derek had started showing up at places where he thought he might run into me, always with some new business proposal that would benefit everyone. Samantha took a different approach. She sent a handwritten letter apologizing for the lawsuit and asking if we could rebuild our relationship. The letter was carefully crafted, hitting all the right emotional notes about family bonds and shared memories. But when I didn't respond immediately, she sent follow-up messages asking if I needed help managing my sudden wealth and offering to introduce me to her business school professors who specialized in financial planning. The most pathetic attempt came from Aunt Catherine, who invited me to lunch at her country club. The invitation mentioned that several of her friends were curious about meeting me, and perhaps we could discuss some mutually beneficial charitable opportunities that would provide excellent tax advantages. I declined all of these overtures. Grandma Margaret had spent 10 years watching how they behaved when they thought there was nothing to gain. I wasn't interested in seeing how they'd behave now that they knew there was. Instead, I focused on the people who had known and loved Grandma Margaret for who she was, not what she had. Mrs. Chen from the apartment building, who still asked about her every time I visited. The volunteers at the food bank who shared stories about her anonymous donations. The residents at Grandview Manor remembered her kindness. 6 months after the inheritance, I established a small memorial garden behind Grandma Margaret's old apartment building. Nothing fancy, just a quiet space with benches and flowers where people could sit and remember. The plaque read simply, "Margaret Patterson. She saw the best in people and helped them see it in themselves." My mom was the only family member who attended the dedication ceremony. She'd been quietly amazed by everything that had happened, but not surprised by Grandma Margaret's choice. "She always said you had her heart," Mom told me as we sat on one of the new benches. "I just never knew she had the means to back up her faith in you." The trust fund for my mom's medical expenses had already proven its worth when she needed surgery for a heart condition she'd been putting off due to cost. Watching her get proper health care without worrying about bankruptcy was worth more than any amount of money my cousins might have inherited. As for Uncle Robert, he found a new office space in a less desirable part of town, paying market rate for the first time in 15 years. His business survived, but barely. Derek ended up working for a competitor after his father couldn't afford to keep him on payroll at the reduced profit margins. Samantha finished her MBA and moved to Denver, where she posts occasional social media updates about her journey of personal growth and family healing. Jessica's influencer career never quite recovered from the negative publicity surrounding the inheritance dispute. Turns out, audiences weren't particularly sympathetic to someone who'd sued their own grandmother's estate. She eventually deleted most of the content about our family drama and pivoted to lifestyle content about finding authentic happiness. I still live modestly, though I upgraded from the studio apartment to a small house near downtown Phoenix. I drive a reliable car instead of my old Honda, but nothing flashy. Most importantly, I continue Grandma Margaret's tradition of helping people without expecting recognition or gratitude. The Margaret Patterson Foundation now manages over $20 million in assets and has helped hundreds of families throughout Arizona. We fund scholarships, support small businesses, and provide emergency assistance to people facing financial crises. Every decision is guided by the same principle that governed Grandma Margaret's life. Help people not because of what they can do for you, but because it's the right thing to do. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if my cousins had made different choices during those 10 years of testing. If Derek had visited more often, if Samantha had offered to help with groceries, if Jessica had called just to chat, would Grandma Margaret have divided the inheritance differently? But then I remember her letter, her belief that people reveal their true character when they think there's nothing to be gained. My cousins had shown who they really were, and so had I. The inheritance wasn't a reward for being perfect, it was recognition for being genuine. The last entry in Grandma Margaret's journal, dated just 2 weeks before she died, read, "Hazel came by today with soup when I mentioned feeling under the weather. She stayed for 2 hours, listening to my stories about her grandfather. She never once checked her phone or seemed impatient. She loves me for who I am, not what I might leave behind. That's the rarest gift anyone can give another person." That's the real inheritance she left me,
Not the money, but the understanding that genuine love and care are the most valuable currencies in any relationship. And unlike financial wealth, those are gifts that multiply when you share them with others. Today, I keep her ancient calculator on my desk, not because I need it for math, but because it reminds me of Tuesday afternoon grocery trips and the woman who taught me that character matters more than cash. She's been gone for over a year now, but her lessons continue to guide every decision I make. The money made everything possible, but love made it all worthwhile. 3 years had passed since the inheritance drama, and Phoenix had become a different city for me. Not because the skyline had changed or new buildings had risen, but because I now saw opportunities everywhere instead of obstacles. Walking through downtown, I'd noticed struggling businesses that reminded me of Casa Rodriguez, or young families that looked like they needed the kind of help Grandma Margaret had quietly provided for decades. The Margaret Patterson Foundation had grown beyond anything I'd initially imagined. What started as a way to formalize my grandmother's charitable giving had evolved into a comprehensive support network touching hundreds of lives across Arizona. We'd funded 67 full college scholarships, helped 43 small businesses through critical growth periods, and provided emergency assistance to over 300 families facing unexpected crises. But the most meaningful project had emerged entirely by accident. Last spring, I'd been visiting one of our scholarship recipients, Maria Gutierrez, a single mother studying nursing at Phoenix Community College. She mentioned that several of her classmates were struggling with childcare costs, often missing classes because they couldn't afford babysitters. That conversation led to the creation of the Phoenix Community Learning Center, a facility that provided both childcare and educational support for parents pursuing degrees or job training. The center operated out of a renovated warehouse in a neighborhood that most people drove through without stopping, exactly the kind of area where Grandma Margaret would have seen potential. Opening day was chaos in the best possible way. 23 children between the ages of 2 and 12, 6 volunteer tutors, and a handful of parents who looked like they couldn't quite believe this resource actually existed. I spent the morning assembling toy shelves and the afternoon reading picture books to a group of 4-year-olds who kept asking if I was the money lady their parents had mentioned. The real validation came 6 months later when Maria passed her nursing boards and got hired at Phoenix General Hospital. She brought her daughter Sophia to the celebration party we threw at the center, and Sophia ran up to me with a drawing she'd made, a crayon picture of a woman holding hands with a little girl under a rainbow. "That's you and me," Sophia explained with the serious tone that only 5-year-olds can manage. "Mama says you helped make it so she could be a nurse and still take care of me." Standing in that converted warehouse, surrounded by the sounds of children playing and parents studying, I finally understood what Grandma Margaret had meant about wealth being a tool rather than a display. The money she'd left me wasn't just assets to be managed, it was potential energy waiting to be converted into real change. That understanding led to my most ambitious project yet, the Phoenix Fresh Start Initiative. Instead of just providing one-time assistance, we created a comprehensive program that addressed the interconnected challenges facing families in poverty: housing assistance, job training, childcare, healthcare navigation, and financial literacy education, all wrapped into a single support system. The first participant was Angela Torres, a woman I'd met at the food bank where Grandma Margaret had volunteered. Angela was 26, had 2 young sons, and was living in her car after losing her apartment when her ex-boyfriend stopped paying child support. She'd been working part-time at a gas station, but couldn't afford the security deposit for a new apartment or the childcare needed to work full-time. Through Fresh Start, we helped Angela secure stable housing, enroll in a medical assistant training program, and access quality childcare for her boys. The program covered her living expenses during the 6-month training period, and our job placement coordinator helped her find employment at a pediatric clinic where she now earns enough to support her family independently. 18 months later, Angela had been promoted to office manager and was saving money for her own house. At our program's first graduation ceremony, she spoke to a room full of other participants about the difference between charity and opportunity. "This wasn't someone giving me a handout," she said, her voice steady and confident in a way that would have been impossible when we first met. "This was someone believing I could build a better life if I had the right tools and support. That belief changes everything."
The graduation ceremony was held at the community center, with families celebrating achievements that ranged from GED completions to professional certifications to business launches. Patricia Gomez, my financial advisor, attended as a guest speaker, sharing practical advice about building credit and managing money. During the reception, I found myself in conversation with Dr. Sarah Chen, the psychiatrist who had evaluated Grandma Margaret's mental competency. She'd become an informal advisor to the foundation, helping us design programs that addressed both practical needs and psychological barriers to success. Your grandmother would be proud, Dr. Chen said, watching Angela's sons play with other children while their mother networked with potential employers. She understood that lasting change happens when you address root causes, not just symptoms. Dr. Chen had shared more insights about Grandma Margaret during our foundation planning meetings. Apparently, their conversations had covered much more than just the psychological evaluation. My grandmother had discussed her philosophy about inherited wealth, her concerns about creating entitled beneficiaries, and her hope that the money would be used to create opportunities rather than dependencies. She called it productive inheritance, Dr. Chen explained, wealth that generates more opportunities for others rather than just comfort for the recipient. She believed that money should work as hard as the people who earned it. That philosophy guided our approach to every project. Rather than simply writing checks, we invested in sustainable solutions that would continue creating value long after our initial funding ended. The Community Learning Center was designed to become self-sustaining through partnerships with local colleges and employers. The Fresh Start initiative trained participants to become mentors for future cohorts, creating a pipeline of success stories who could guide others through similar challenges. The ripple effects were becoming visible throughout Phoenix. Maria Gutierrez, now a registered nurse, had started a support group for other healthcare workers who were single parents. Elena Rodriguez had expanded Casa Rodriguez into a second location and was employing 12 people, including 2 Fresh Start graduates. Angela Torres was taking evening classes toward a bachelor's degree in social work, planning to eventually join our foundation staff. These success stories attracted attention from other philanthropists and community organizations. The Phoenix Fresh Start model was being replicated in Tucson and Flagstaff, with plans for expansion into New Mexico and Colorado. What had started as one person's inheritance had become a blueprint for community-based wealth building. But the most unexpected development came through an unlikely source, Jessica Patterson. My cousin had reached out through LinkedIn, of all places, asking if we could meet for coffee. I almost declined, assuming it was another attempt to access family money, but something in her message seemed different. We met at a small cafe near Arizona State University, and I barely recognized her. Gone were the designer clothes and Instagram-perfect appearance. She looked tired but genuine in a way that I'd never seen before. "I've been following the foundation's work through the news coverage," she began, stirring her coffee nervously. I wanted to apologize, but more than that, I wanted to ask if there might be a way for me to contribute something meaningful. The story that emerged was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Jessica's influencer career had completely collapsed after the inheritance controversy, leaving her deep in debt and forced to move back to Phoenix. She'd been working at a nonprofit that served homeless youth, initially just for the paycheck, but had discovered a passion for advocacy work that surprised her. "I know I don't deserve anything from the family," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was selfish and cruel, and I know that. But I've learned things about myself these past few years, and I've seen what real poverty looks like. If there's any way I can help with your programs, even as a volunteer, I'd like to try." The request was so unexpected that I needed time to process it. This was the same person who had sued Grandma Margaret's estate and posted TikToks about family betrayal. But sitting across from her, I saw something that reminded me of myself 3 years earlier, someone who had been humbled by circumstances and was genuinely seeking a chance to do better. After consulting with Dr. Chen and the Foundation Board, we offered Jessica a 6-month volunteer position with our youth outreach program. No salary, no special treatment, just an opportunity to prove that her transformation was genuine. She accepted immediately. 6 months turned into a full-time position when Jessica demonstrated not just commitment, but real skill in connecting with teenagers who had aged out of foster care. Her experience with social media, previously used for self-promotion, became valuable for raising awareness about youth homelessness and connecting young people with resources.
The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. Jessica Patterson, who had once embodied everything Grandma Margaret disapproved of, was now using her talents to help the most vulnerable members of our community. It was a reminder that people can change, but only when they're genuinely motivated by something larger than self-interest. The Foundation's third anniversary celebration was held at the Phoenix Convention Center, with over 500 people attending: scholarship recipients, business owners we'd supported, families who had participated in Fresh Start, volunteers, and community partners. The keynote speaker was Dr. James Chen, a cardiovascular surgeon whose medical school education had been funded by one of Grandma Margaret's anonymous scholarships 20 years ago. Dr. Chen had only recently learned the identity of his benefactor when we'd reached out to document the long-term impact of my grandmother's giving. His presentation about the ripple effects of educational investment brought many people to tears, including me. "I've performed over 3,000 heart surgeries in my career," he said, addressing the packed auditorium. "Each of those procedures was made possible by a woman who believed in investing in people rather than things. Margaret Patterson saved lives she never met through the education she made possible." As I listened to Dr. Chen speak, I felt Grandma Margaret's presence more strongly than I had since her funeral. She would have loved seeing this room full of people whose lives had been touched by her quiet generosity. More importantly, she would have been proud that her wealth had been used to create more opportunities rather than simply more comfort. The evening concluded with the announcement of our newest initiative, the Margaret Patterson Institute for Community Wealth Building. Rather than just providing direct services, the Institute would train other organizations to replicate our model, creating a network of community-based programs that addressed poverty through comprehensive support rather than temporary assistance. As guests mingled during the reception, I found myself standing alone for a moment, observing the conversations happening around me. Former scholarship recipients were networking with current students. Business owners were discussing partnerships with nonprofit directors. Parents were sharing childcare resources while their children played together in the designated family area. This was what Grandma Margaret had envisioned when she made her careful plans, not just financial security for one person, but financial opportunity for entire communities. She had understood that true wealth isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you help others achieve. Later that night, I sat in my study with the journal that Grandma Margaret had left behind, reading her entries one more time. The final page contained a note that I'd never noticed before, written in different ink and apparently added after the other entries. "Hazel, if you're reading this, then I succeeded in choosing the right heir. Wealth is not about having more than you need, it's about having enough to help others get what they need. Use this gift wisely, and remember that the greatest inheritance you can leave behind is not money, but the positive change you create in other people's lives. Love always, Grandma Margaret." Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help, and new ways to honor the lessons she'd taught me. But tonight, I simply felt grateful for her wisdom, for the unexpected journey that had brought me here, and for the reminder that the best investments are always in people. The phone rang, interrupting my reflection. It was Angela Torres, calling to share that she'd been accepted into a bachelor's degree program in social work, with plans to eventually join our foundation team. As we talked about her goals and the scholarship support that would make them possible, I realized that Grandma Margaret's greatest gift wasn't the money itself. It was the understanding that every person has the potential to create positive change when given the right opportunities. And that understanding, unlike any financial inheritance, would continue growing and multiplying for generations to come. The conversation with Angela sparked an idea that had been forming in my mind for months. What if we could create a formal pathway for program participants to transition from beneficiaries to leaders within the foundation? The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with our board to propose the Margaret Patterson Leadership Academy, a program that would train successful graduates to become community organizers, program coordinators, and eventually foundation staff members. The board meeting took place in the same conference room where Thomas Mitchell had first revealed Grandma Margaret's wealth. Now, instead of discussing legal challenges, we were planning how to scale our impact across the entire Southwest. Board member Dr. Elizabeth Warren, not the senator, but a local economist who specialized in community development, presented data showing that our model was producing measurable improvements in economic mobility throughout Phoenix. The longitudinal data is remarkable, Dr. Warren explained, pointing to charts that tracked participants' progress over 2- and 3-year periods. Traditional assistance programs show temporary improvements followed by regression to baseline conditions, but your comprehensive model is creating sustained upward mobility that continues accelerating over time. The statistics were encouraging, but what really mattered to me were the individual stories behind those numbers. Like Carlos Mendoza, a former construction worker who had lost his job due to a back injury and was facing eviction when he entered our program. Through Fresh Start, Carlos had retrained as a computer technician, launched his own IT support business, and was now employing 3 other program graduates. Or Sarah Kim, a refugee from South Korea who spoke limited English when she joined our workforce development initiative. She had completed our English as a second language program, earned certification as a medical interpreter, and was now working at 4 different hospitals throughout the Phoenix metro area while pursuing a nursing degree. These success stories led to an unexpected opportunity. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation had taken notice of our work and invited me to present at their annual Pathways to Prosperity conference in Seattle. The invitation came through Dr. Patricia Santos, a Gates Foundation program officer who had been following our model through academic publications and news coverage. Flying to Seattle for the conference was surreal. 5 years ago, I had been clipping coupons and worrying about bus fare. Now, I was being asked to share insights with philanthropists who managed billions of dollars in charitable giving. The presentation went well, but the real value came from conversations with other foundation leaders who were struggling to create sustainable change in their own communities. The Gates Foundation Conference led to partnerships with organizations in 12 different states, all interested in adapting our model to their local contexts. Each partnership brought new challenges and learning opportunities. Rural communities had different needs than urban areas. Regions with different economic bases required modified approaches. But the core principle remained constant. Comprehensive support that addressed multiple barriers simultaneously produced better outcomes than fragmented assistance. Meanwhile, the family dynamics continued evolving in unexpected directions. Derek Patterson had reached out through Jessica, asking if he could meet with me about a business proposal. My initial instinct was to decline, but curiosity went out. We met at a restaurant in Scottsdale, where Derek presented a detailed plan for a social enterprise that would provide affordable housing while generating sustainable returns for investors. "I know I have no right to ask for your support," Derek said, his usual arrogance replaced by something that might have been humility. "But I've spent the last 2 years studying what you've accomplished with the foundation, and I think I understand now what Grandma Margaret was trying to teach us." His proposal was actually thoughtful and well-researched. Derek wanted to develop mixed-income housing communities that would include market-rate units, workforce housing, and affordable units supported by foundation investments. The communities would feature on-site childcare centers, job training centers, and small business incubation spaces, essentially creating neighborhoods that embodied the comprehensive support model we'd developed. The proposal was intriguing, but I needed time to evaluate both the business plan and Derek's motivations. After consulting with our board and doing due diligence on Derek's recent work, we agreed to fund a pilot project with strict oversight and performance metrics. The first Phoenix Commons development broke ground 18 months later, featuring 120 mixed-income units and community facilities that served both residents and the surrounding neighborhood. Uncle Robert's story took a different trajectory. His real estate business had struggled after losing the below-market office lease, and he'd eventually been forced to merge with a larger firm. The experience had been humbling, but it had also given him perspective on the advantages he'd enjoyed without recognizing them. He never directly apologized or asked for assistance, but he did start volunteering with Habitat for Humanity, quietly using his construction knowledge to help build homes for low-income families. Aunt Catherine's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. After the inheritance controversy, she had been ostracized by some members of her country club social circle, leading to a period of genuine self-reflection. She eventually resigned her memberships and began volunteering with a nonprofit that provided professional clothing and job interview coaching for women re-entering the workforce. When Catherine reached out to offer her services to our foundation, I was skeptical. But her experience with corporate networking and professional development proved valuable for our business mentorship program. She brought a level of polish and connections that helped our entrepreneur participants access markets and opportunities that might otherwise have been out of reach. The most surprising development came from Samantha, who had moved to Denver and seemed to have disappeared from the family narrative entirely. She surfaced unexpectedly when she published an article in the Harvard Business Review titled "The Hidden Costs of Inherited Privilege, a Personal Case Study." The article detailed her experience with the inheritance dispute and the lessons she'd learned about entitlement, family dynamics, and the difference between earned and unearned advantages. Samantha's article went viral in business and academic circles, leading to speaking engagements and consulting opportunities with wealthy families trying to navigate similar challenges. She donated all her speaking fees to organizations that supported first-generation college students, explaining in interviews that she was trying to pay forward the educational opportunities I took for granted. These family reconciliations weren't complete or uncomplicated, but they represented genuine growth that would have made Grandma Margaret proud. She had always believed that people could change when they encountered the right combination of consequences and opportunities. My cousins had faced the consequences of their behavior, and now some of them were choosing to pursue opportunities for redemption. The Foundation's work continued expanding in scope and sophistication. We launched a policy advocacy initiative, working with state legislators to address systemic barriers that prevented families from achieving economic stability. Our research department began publishing studies that influenced how other organizations approached poverty alleviation. We established an endowment that would ensure the Foundation's work could continue indefinitely, even if economic conditions changed. But the most meaningful development was personal rather than professional. I met David Chen, Dr. Sarah Chen's nephew, at a Foundation fundraising event. David was a social worker who specialized in family therapy, and he shared my passion for addressing root causes rather than just symptoms of social problems. Our first date was at Casa Rodriguez, where Elena insisted on preparing a special meal to celebrate what she called the beginning of Hazel's next chapter. David understood the complexities of inherited wealth and the responsibilities that came with it. His own family had immigrated from Taiwan with very little money, and he had worked his way through college and graduate school. He brought perspective and balance to my life, reminding me that personal happiness was just as important as professional impact. When we got engaged 2 years later, the celebration was held at the Community Learning Center, surrounded by the families and children who had become extended family to me. The wedding itself was modest but meaningful, with donations to the Foundation requested instead of gifts. Dr. Sarah Chen officiated the ceremony, sharing insights about the importance of partnerships built on shared values and complementary strengths. Our honeymoon was a working trip to Costa Rica, where we visited community-based organizations that were implementing similar models to address rural poverty. The experience reinforced my belief that the principles Grandma Margaret had taught me were universal. That genuine care, strategic thinking, and patient investment in people's potential could create positive change anywhere. Returning to Phoenix, David and I moved into a house in the same neighborhood where Grandma Margaret had lived, close to the Memorial Garden and the original apartment building where our story had begun. The choice was intentional, a reminder of where the journey started and the values that continue to guide it. The Foundation's 5th anniversary gala was held at the Phoenix Art Museum, with over 800 attendees including program participants, community partners, donors, and local officials. The keynote speaker was Dr. James Chen, who had become a close friend and advisor to the Foundation. His presentation focused on the ripple effects of strategic philanthropy and the importance of measuring success across generations rather than quarters. During my remarks that evening, I shared the story of finding Grandma Margaret's final note and the realization that her greatest gift wasn't the money itself, but the understanding of how to use wealth responsibly. I announced the creation of the Margaret Patterson Endowment for Community Wealth Building, funded with $50 million from the original inheritance and designed to support similar initiatives across the United States. The announcement generated significant media attention and inquiries from communities throughout the country. More importantly, it attracted the attention of other wealthy individuals who were interested in using their resources to create systemic change rather than just temporary relief. The endowment became a catalyst for a broader movement toward what economists were calling regenerative philanthropy, giving that creates sustainable capacity for ongoing positive change. As the evening wound down, I found myself on the museum's outdoor terrace, looking out over the Phoenix skyline that had become so much more than just a backdrop to my life. The city lights stretched toward the mountains, representing millions of individual stories and dreams and struggles. Somewhere out there were future scholarship recipients who didn't yet know their potential, entrepreneurs with ideas that could transform their communities, families facing challenges that seemed insurmountable but weren't. David joined me on the terrace, bringing 2 cups of coffee and the comfortable silence that comes from shared understanding. We stood together, planning the next phase of our work and our life together, secure in the knowledge that Grandma Margaret's legacy would continue growing long after we were gone. The ancient calculator that had once sat on her kitchen table now occupied a place of honor in my office, next to her journal and the letter that had explained everything. Sometimes visitors ask about the old-fashioned device, and I would tell them about Tuesday afternoon grocery trips and a woman who had taught me that true wealth lies not in what you accumulate, but in what you help others achieve. That lesson, more than any amount of money, had become the inheritance that would last forever. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.